I think the PPT is visible to you, right? Yes or no? Am I audible
So the screen is visible.
now?
Yes, sir.
Fine. So yesterday was posted a link on sampling design. It's a 12 minutes video. If you are able to watch that, you can easily understand what is sampling, what is different types of sampling, probability sampling, non-probability sampling, different types, difference between sample error and sample error, etc., and so on, right? So today, in formal, we are going to discuss about sampling design. It's an important topic of discussion. Once data is being collected by you, then how to do the sampling. So which sampling strategy works for you, etc., and so on. We are going to discuss in this class. So let us understand first census and sample survey. What do you mean by census? So census is nothing but considering entire population. So what is population? For example, let us take example of India. So if we are considering for our research entire population of India, there is no conditions, there is no constraint. Simply blindly we are choosing entire populations, entire all the peoples who are living in India. So we can consider it as a census inquiry. If we are considering each and every individual, that is called as enumeration of all items in population is known as census inquiry. If we are putting the census means group under the inquiry, then it is called as census inquiry. Suppose if you are if you want to conduct a research about the census of a population, usually we are going with census work inquiry. But in real time, conducting the census inquiry is really it is very much difficult because it is a most time consuming and cost is also involved. So, asking the question to every individual of a person in this India nationwide, it is a highly difficult and impossible work. You cannot finish your research in a 1 year or 2 year because around more than 130 crores of peoples are there with different mindset, different traditions, different cultures. If you are asking the question, everyone you may end up with the mass of the answers. It is very highly difficult to inference the drawn the results of that population, right? That's why instead of going with census inquiry, so try to go with the sample survey. So but in census, even the government adopts this is in very rare cases, such as population census conducted once in a decade, every 10 years. Even government also makes the population census once in a 10 year. So because it is a time consuming process and it is difficult to inquire every individual sample of a population. So because it is time bounded. Okay. So whereas a sample survey is that instead of going with the entire all elements present in the universe, so it needs to be emphasized that when the universe is a small one. For example, instead of going with the census survey of entire Bangalore, you can go with a sample survey. You can go with the one institution. One institution. Uh, so instead of the going with the entire Bangalore population, you choose the one with suppose if you are choosing BMSIT as a one sample among the several educational institutions. Okay. So in that case, you can choose a one institution as a sample of the entire universe or the population. So when field studies are undertaken in practical life, considerations of time and cost almost invariably lead to a selection of response. So choosing the sample survey also, it is very much needed to assess the time and cost it is required to collect the data. So selection of only a few items. The respondents selected should be as representative of the total population. So as instead of again asking individual students in an institution about the survey, instead choose a only the head of the department of the persons as a samples in this sampling. So that head of the department represents the entire population, right? The respondents selected should be as representative of the total population as possible in order to produce a miniature cross section. Means instead of again asking individual students to inquiry, because one institute can have the more than 1500 to the 3000 students, it is highly difficult to again go with individual students to inquire them. Maybe the questionnaire it may include one question or multiple questions also. In that case again it is a time consuming and cost is involved. It is up to the researcher as to decide the size of the population and sample of the survey. Okay, the selected respondents constitute what is technically called as a sample. Here what you have chosen, heads of the department, you can treat it as a sample. Institute is nothing but it is a sample survey. So in that institution, you are choosing one sample, like one from one department, HOD representing the entire department. So all together, if you put together all samples, it represents the institutional level, right? And the selection process is called as sampling technique. What we made the sampling technique, the selection process is we have selected the sample like HODs. So based on what? Because they are representing the entire department. So that technique is called as sampling technique. If you are conducting the survey on the sample which you have collected the sampling, it is called as a sample survey. Is it clear? So what is the difference between census survey and sample survey? In the census survey, all the items will be considered for our survey of inquiry. So it is most of the time census survey is very much it is difficult. Very much it is difficult because it is so entire population, entire enumeration of people you need to be considered. So whereas in sample survey, again you are selecting in that among the entire population, you are choosing a specific set of the subpopulation size. Some subpopulation, again you are choosing some samples. Those samples, how you are choosing the sample in such a way that that sample represents the entire population. So if you apply the techniques called as the choosing the person who is representing the entire organization, it is called as sample, and the process of selection it is called as sampling technique. If you do conduct the survey on that sample, it is called as sample survey. So in general, in mathematically it is represented as, let the population size be n. So for example, the college size is 3000, n equal to 3000 here. And if a part of size n, so among the 3000, only the class representatives, you can name it as a small n. So among the 3000 students, about 8,008 department, in each class, in each department, there is a 4-year course. So in each course, 2 to representation from one department, 8 students from 8 departments, 64 students. Here small n equal to 64 students. So capital N is 3000. Among 3000 students, 64 students represents the individual branches and the department. Of this population is selected according to some rule. What rule I applied here to selecting the sample? To selecting the sample, I applied the rule. The constraint I applied is the class representative. Why applied class representative? Because I am going to study about a department, how they are performing, what are the difficulty the students are facing in learning or interacting with the faculty, etc. and so on. Some study I am going to make. Based on my study of interest, I am choosing a sample among the available population size. So the characteristics of the population, the group consisting of these n units is known as sample. Here the class representatives represents a sample of the entire population of 3000 students. Researcher must prepare a sample design for his study. That is, he must plan how a sample should be selected and of what size such a sample would be. So again, it is independent researcher decision and the study and reducing the sampling errors. So researcher has to plan the sampling study and how a sample is going to be selected, on what basis is selecting, what was the intention, what is the purpose of selection of those samples. It is up to the researcher knowledge. And size of a sample would be, if the sample size is very low, the sampling error will be high. If the sample size is very high, the error rate will be low, but the inquiry of study of the sampling, it will take more time and cost. So some of the implications of the sample design as below. So the sample design is nothing but it's a definite plan for obtaining a sample from a given population. If you think of our college as a one population of 3000 students, so to collect some sample from this 3000 student, obviously we'll have a plan for it. It refers to the technique or the procedure the researcher would adopt in selecting items for the sample. If you are selecting a class representative, what is the technique you adopted? So you want to know about the, instead of asking the question about how you are performing, what is the difficulty you are facing, instead of asking every individual 3000 student, if you ask, it will take lots of time and cost also. It will take lot of efforts also needed. So instead of that, you are sampling the students like class representations. So the sample design may as well lay down the number of items to be included in the sample. So according to our example, 64 students of class representatives from 8 department is our sample size of the sample. Sample design is determined before data are collected. Once so you decide the 64 students, so again you can differentiate how among the 64 sample size, again you are going to decide so how many number of the class representative, male representative, how many number of the female representative you are going to differentiate. If it is 50-50 or 100% or 30-60, 30-70 or the 60-40, how you are going to define. So before start inquiring with respect to the data collection, so you need to have a definite plan. So that is workable plan before start collecting the data, right? So there are many sample designs from which a researcher can choose. There are several types of sample designs. So some of the sampling designs we are going to discuss in the down the line. Some designs are relatively more precise and easier to apply than others. So some designs are relatively more precise. Okay, and easy to apply than others. Some predefined designs are there, so by understanding them you can make use of them in your the research. So researcher must select or prepare a sample design which should be reliable and appropriate for his research study. Always sampling selection and the design of the sample based on the researcher study of his research interest. So some of the steps involve how to choose the sample design, how to develop a sampling design. So the following the points needs to be understood by the researcher. So how to design the how to develop a sampling design. Am I audible? Am I audible?
Hello,
Yes,
Vanilla.
sir.
Hello, Vanilla. No.
Benakraj, am I audible? Benakraj, mute your mic.
Yes, sir. Audible, sir.
Yes, sir. Audible, sir.
So the following steps need to be followed to define and develop the sample design. Benakraj, mute your mic. If any questions you can ask me. Otherwise, mute your mic. Benakraj.
ಅದ್ರ ರುಚಿ ಇರ್ಬೇಕಲ್ಲ.
Any one of you call him to mute the mic. The very first step in developing a sampling device is type of universe. So type of universe might be, suppose if you are studying population related means peoples are the here, the people, etc. and so on. The subject of your interest. For example, the first step in developing any sample design is to clearly define the set of object. Which object you are studying? Suppose it is technically it is called as universe. Universe to be studied. The universe can be finite or infinite. So the universe can be finite or infinite. If you are studying about the population, people is the universe. So if you go with census survey, usually again it is a so finite study. Suppose if you go with the world population, usually it will go with the infinite. ಎಲ್ಲರಿಗೂ usually it is go with the infinite. So the universe can be finite or infinite. In finite universe, the number of items is certain. Means it is countable. In the finite universe, the number of items is countable. It is certain. But in case of an infinite universe, if you go with the population of India, it is somehow it is finite. So when you go with the global scenario, so the people living on the earth, if they are remotely, if they are living, some people are even they will not under the consideration of the countables. So in such cases, it is difficult to enquiry those kind of the peoples. Usually, it is termed as infinite. We cannot have any idea about the total number of items. So the population of a city, the number of workers in a factory are examples for finite universes. So because the people strength is limited, people total size is limited, number of workers in a factory, for example in the BMSIT, number of workers in the BMSIT campus, approximately nearly 500. Okay, so it is a countable, it's a finite. Suppose if you go with the number of stars in the sky, how many number of stars? Difficult to count, right? Listeners of a specific radio program, how many listeners are there? How do you measure? Nowadays it is countable, it's a finite, but if you go with the count of number of stars in the sky, you can treat it as a infinite. With the help of technology, you can even measure the listeners, how many people are listening the radio program. That is possible to measure. Throwing of a dice, etc. are the examples of infinite universes. Okay, so the first step need to be followed to develop a sampling design by the researcher is choosing the identifying the object set of object which you are going to collect the samples. The second the step is sampling unit. Among the object, which is the sample unit, a decision has to be taken concerning a sampling unit before selecting a sample. So the sampling unit, either you are going with the state, or you are going with the district, or you are going with the village, or you are going with the educational institutions. Sampling unit may be a geographical one, such as state, district, village, etc., or a construction unit such as house, flat, etc., or it may be a social unit such as family, club, school, etc., or it may be an individual. So before start identifying the sample, first identify the sampling unit. The researcher will have to decide one or more of such units that he has to select for his study. Again, it is up to the researcher. He has to select whether the geographical kind of the unit, or the construction kind, or family social kind. So which type of the unit he wants to make it on his study, he required to study the sampling unit. Once he has selected with sampling unit, in our case we are studying about the stress facing by the students, difficulty facing in the students of an institution. Usually it comes under the social unit. The third step is source list. It is also known as sampling frame, where you are obtaining the source. Which sample is to be drawn? Which sample is to be drawn? Yes, among 3000 students, which sample is suitable for your study? It contains the name of all items of a universe. So, in case of finite universe only. Suppose you are studying the student mindset or the student difficulty facing in the institution. So, usually it's a finite universe because 3000 limited numbers are there, 3000 students. If source list is not available, researcher has to prepare it. Such a list should be comprehensive, correct, reliable, and appropriate. If it is infinite case, it is the responsibility of the researcher. It is extremely important for the source list to be as representative of the population as possible. Okay, the researcher has to prepare the source list which is reliable, correct, comprehensive, and appropriate. So it should represent the entire population. Third step is source listing, or it is also called as sampling frame. The fourth step is size of sample. Yes, among the 3000, the size you are going to select it for 64. Whether you want just 64 is a study or 600 is your study, which one it affords for you, that is left to the researcher. Size of sample. This refers to the number of items to be selected from the universe to constitute a sample. This is a major problem before a researcher. The size of sample should neither be excessively large nor too small. It should be optimum. An optimum sample is one which fulfills the requirements of efficiency, representativeness, reliability, and flexibility. While deciding the size of sample, researcher must determine the desired precision as also an acceptable confidence level for the estimate. Okay? So the precision is nothing but the acceptable confidence level. Whether 90% you are accepting or 95% of result you are accepting or 97% you are accepting, or what? You are exclusively, you need to be defined that one. Okay? Size of sample is the fourth component. Fifth component. Parameters of interest. In determining the sample design, one must consider the question of the specific population parameters which are of interest. What is our interest of discussion? Sampling design of the preparing the sample design for the students facing difficulty in their academics. In the campus, population size is 3000, sampling size is 64 students. The sample of a parameter of interest is study about the stress faced by the students. Then the sixth, budgetary constraint. Budgetary constraint. Again, budget is always depend on the size of the sample size. So cost consideration from practical point of view have a major impact upon decisions relating to not only the size of the sample but also the type of sample. This fact can even lead to the use of a non-probability sample. So cost budgetary constraint is also very important here. If the research cost is 10,000 rupees, if you are spending 90% the amount on the sampling itself, then it is over cost for sampling. You are spending most over spending on the sampling. So it will end up with in between. So research is not going to be carried out. So that's why planning is necessity before carrying out the research, because budget allocation is also one of the major component for conducting the research work. And the seventh component in sampling design is sampling procedure. So finally the researcher must decide the type of sample he will use. That is, he must decide about the technique to be used in selecting the items for the sample. So, again, he has to decide the type of sample. So, among the available population. In fact, this technique or procedure stands for the sampling design itself. There are several sample design out of which the researcher must choose one for his study. So there are predefined some sampling design techniques are there, procedures are there. It helps the researcher to choose one among them. He must select that design which for a given sample size and for a given cost has a smaller sampling error. If he is going with the sampling procedure, one of the sampling technique which is available, usually he will end up with a small sampling error. Otherwise, if he chooses as he wants, then it will end up with larger error. Larger error rate is nothing but it's not acceptable for the conclusion or for the decision making. Okay, is it clear? What are the steps involved in developing a sample design? Type of universe need to be, the set of object needs to study. Then sampling unit among that object, which are the interested units to be studied, and the source list, which is the sampling sample to be, which type of the sample is to be drawn as a source list. Size of the sample, maximum size of sample you need to undergo the study. Parameter of interest or the you need to be identify which component you are stressing on to study, like stress level of a student is the parameter of the interest to study. In our example, budgetary also needs to be planned well in advance to carry out the sampling design. So sampling process among the available samples, sampling templates, you can choose one to reduce the sampling error. Otherwise, it will end up with the large sampling errors. So large sampling errors, from that we cannot infer or make the decisions with the large sampling errors. So criteria of selecting a sampling procedure. How to select the sampling procedure? Right. So among the available, which is the good, which is the bad, etc. and so on, we will understand how to select criteria of selecting a sampling procedure. One must remember that two costs are involved in sampling analysis. One is cost of collecting the data and the cost of incorrect inference resulting from the data. These two are the cost of the collecting data. Cost of collecting data directly impact on your sampling design, and once being collected the data, after that if you are trying to draw the inference from that existing collected data, if it will have a more diversion of sampling error, again it leads to a cost to you, because if more sampling error means you need to be redefine the sampling design again. Right, you need to follow all the above 7 steps to refine the process of data collection. Okay, that's why these are the two costs are involved. One for cost of collecting the data, another for cost of an incorrect inference resulting from the data. So researcher must keep in the view the two causes of incorrect inferences. So what are the two causes of incorrect inferences? That is systematic bias and sampling error. So systematic bias and sampling. In the systematic bias, it is already it is up to the knowledge of the researcher. He has, after applying the systematic, he is going to introduce some errors in the sampling procedures, and it cannot be reduced or eliminated by increasing the size. In the systematic, it is already predefined. It is a bias results a systematic bias results from errors. There is an error in the sampling procedure. You cannot reduce that error or eliminate even though by increasing the sample size. It is called as systematic bias. And the causes responsible for these errors can be detected and corrected. Usually systematic bias is the result of one or more of the following factor. Right? Got my point? Systematic bias that can even, so usually by increasing the sampling sizes, errors might be reduced. But in case of systematic bias, it is not possible to reduce or eliminating the errors. So these are the some appropriate measures to reduce The usually a systematic bias is the result of one or more of the following factors. So you are going to get the systematic bias by following the following factors. So one is inappropriate sampling frame. If you are not properly selecting the samples from the available population, it will end up with the systematic bias. The second factor affects on the systematic bias is defective measuring device. So instead of selecting the social population, you are selecting the construction unit of population to determine the stress level of the student. So it is you are doing something, selecting something, planning something. There is a mismatch between all these three steps. It will end up with systematic bias. And the non-respondents, you are choosing a sample. If you inquire the question, if you ask the question for such sample which you have chosen, those samples are not ready to answer your questions, then again there is a possibility of systematic bias. If we are unable to sample all the individuals initially included in the sample, there may arise a systematic bias. The reason is that in such a situation, the likelihood of establishing a contact or receiving a response from an individual is often correlated with the measure of what is to be estimated. The non-respondent, what they are going to give the answer for your questions. So again, it will lead to a systematic bias. So which are the factors? Inappropriate sampling frame, defective measuring device, non-respondents are the factors that leads to a systematic bias. And the fifth also leads to a systematic bias, that is indeterminacy principle. So indeterminacy principle is that sometimes we find that individuals act differently when kept under observation than what they do when kept in non-observed situation. For example, in the classroom, if the teacher is not observing the students, the people acts differently. If the teacher start observing, the students act differently. So while observation, something they will do. When we are not observing, something they will do. That is called as indeterminacy principle. So natural bias in the reporting of the data is often the cause of a systematic bias in many inquiries. For example, there is usually a downward bias in the income. For example, if I ask, suppose a student searching for a girl to get married. So during that time, you are disclosing your annual income. So what you are going to disclose? I am drawing 10 lakh plus income. So whether it is true figure or false figure, we don't know. So while searching the girl for the marriage, so you are disclosing high income because so you are trying to attract the parent of that girl. Yes, he is capable of surviving our girl, etc. and so on. So suppose if the income tax people writes your office or the home, in that case, what you are going to claim? Sir, I am getting only 3 lakh of remuneration annually. You are trying to hide the actual returns you are getting from your job. Here, one person, based on the context and situation, he is biasing his answer. But depending on the context, he is trying to tell the answer, the same person. Right, in that case, it is called as natural bias. Okay, so you can take the example of this. The income data collected by the government taxation department, whereas we find an upward bias in the income data collected by some social organization. People in general understate their incomes if asked about it for tax purposes. When people start, if you are started asking the questions to the general public, they will start hiding the actual incomes what they are getting to avoid the taxes. But they overstate the same if asked for social status. If you are asking social status or their affluence in the social appreciations, they will tell, yes, I'm this year I made a so and so business, this many number of crores I turnover, etc. So to improve their status level in the societal, they are giving the upward biases. So when the taxation purpose downward biases they are doing. So generally in psychological surveys, people tend to give what they think is the correct answer rather than revealing their true feelings. Okay. So this is natural bias in reporting of data. And this sampling and non-sampling errors. So please make a note of this. You can take a screenshot of this. It is referred from this key differences between the sampling and non-sampling errors. What is the meaning of sampling error? Sampling error is a type of error occurs due to the sample selected does not perfectly represents the population of interest. For example, in our college scenario, among the 3,000 students, including the faculty and other staffs working here, suppose if I ask what you know about your college to the newly joined security personnel, what he is going to tell about the college? That is wrong choosing of sample. Wrong choosing of sample is called as sampling error. If you are asked about the housekeeping person, tell about the C programming language, what he or she is going to tell. So sampling what you are choosing is, if it is biases, it is not representing the population of your research study of interest, then it's called as sampling error. Non-sampling error is that you chosen right sample, still you are unable to draw some conclusion. An error occurs due to sources other than sampling. While conducting survey activities is known as non-sampling error. Sample is selected right. While asking question to that sample, questionnaire may not be fit to ask the questions, or it may introduce some errors in between. Suppose class representative, if he or her is good about the college, they will start providing the proper information. If they are ignorant, if they are arrogant, they may give some other false information. So such kind of things are non-sampling error. Sample selected is proper, but error is introduced in between. It's a non-sampling error. The cause, what is the reason for sampling error? Deviation between sample mean and population mean. Deviation between sample mean and population mean. Deficiency and analysis of data. So non-sampling error, deficiency and analysis of data, whereas sampling error is deviation between sample mean and population mean. What is the mean? Total number of the population divided by n. What is sample mean? Total number of the sample you selected divided by n. If there is a deviation, then it end up with sampling error. The type is sampling error is random because you chosen the random samples while deciding while studying your research of interest. In the non-sampling, there are two possibilities: random or non-random also. Usually random comes in the topic of probability. So probability is chance of getting selected, right? So occurs is only when sample is selected, both in sample and census. This sampling error happens in the selection error. If selection is not good, sampling error, it will leads to sampling error, or if in non-sampling error, it is happens through both sampling as well as census survey also. Sample size, possibility of error reduce with the increase in sample size. Sampling error rate can be reduced by increasing the sample size, whereas in non-sampling error it has nothing to do with the sample size, because rightly you chosen the sample, but error happens in between in the questionnaire or the data collection, so you cannot do anything do with the non-sampling error. But in sampling error you can reduce that sampling error by increasing the size of the sample. Okay, this is the difference between this is the important difference between the sampling and non-sampling errors. Now we will learn types of sampling designs. So I'll take the 10 minutes break. So again I will be back here to discuss the types of sampling designs. Okay.